And now, live from the Newman Library Athenaeum on the Blacksburg campus of Virginia Tech, this is Vox Humanities Communications. I'm sorry. This is Vox Humanities Conversations with your host, the Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, Dr. Sylvester Johnson.
I'm Sylvester Johnson, and this is Vox Humanities Conversations, a live streaming program from the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. As with all productions under the Vox Humanities Media imprint, the Conversations Initiative places its focus on the advancement of human-centered knowledge. We do this by engaging with experts and scholars whose work explores human life and human culture through a critical lens, and which serves to enhance public understanding around the impact of social disparity in a complex world. What makes Conversations unique is an emphasis on sharing stories that connect us to the humanity within the humanities. For each episode, we invite one or more guests to open a window onto the story of their scholarship, both the story that stands behind their work and the story that lives within. When you think of K-12 neighborhood schools, what comes to mind? Maybe kids walking or biking to school, or dozens of those iconic yellow buses transporting gaggles of talkative youngsters for another day of learning. It's safe to say that your idea of neighborhood schools depends on where you live. There are tremendous differences between urban schools and rural or suburban schools. In 2013, almost a decade ago, the city of Chicago closed nearly 50 schools at one time. That's right, 49 to be exact. That decision was justified as a way to cut costs and create more financial efficiency. We should note Chicago's public school system enrolls more than 340,000 students across more than 600 schools. The Washington Post reported a few years after that the massive school closure negatively impacted the families and communities who attended those schools, and it created tremendous challenges. Urban schools, unlike their rural and suburban counterparts, typically operate under extreme challenges marked by severe wealth disparities, overcrowding, violence, widespread homelessness, dilapidated buildings, and so on. And because American schools are supported by property taxes, they vividly reflect the differences in household wealth that exist in our society. Our guest today, Professor Cahen, has become an expert in urban school issues. She researches the connections between where schools are located, their geography, and the politics that affects the school's students and the school's teachers and the communities. Professor Cahen examines Newark, New Jersey as a case study into why urban school districts are alternately being dismantled, diminished, and privatized, what this has to do with race, why local communities continue to fight to save schools labeled as failures, and how the restructuring of public education is linked to broader patterns of displacement that disproportionately impact majority Black and brown urban neighborhoods today. Welcome, Professor Cahen. We're so glad you could join us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to begin by you just telling us, what do you do here at Virginia Tech?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor in urban affairs and planning at the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. I'm also a fellow with the Center for Humanities and affiliated with the Institute for Policy and Governance as well.
Well, thanks for joining us to talk about this issue. It's a very complicated one, extremely important. And I'd love to begin, if you could just identify for us what you perceive to be the most important and the most difficult challenges that our urban schools are facing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so it's a great question, and I'd want to answer it in two ways, two challenges that are intimately linked and actually operate as a vicious cycle, and that is defunding and privatization. So studies of funding in urban public school districts agree that funding for public education has not rebounded since the 2008 crisis. And now we're on the precipice, or some would argue already, in a new recession, which will likely mean further cuts to school districts that have still not returned to their pre-2008 funding levels. Now, there are differences that varies from city to city, from state to state, but by and large, this is the trend. And now that can be compounded by a form of educational reform that was really promoted simultaneously, sometimes a little bit before 2008, but which really took off thereafter, which argued that both to increase market efficiency and to improve the quality of public schools, new alternatives needed to be created to schools that were run by public school districts. And privately managed but publicly funded charter schools began to dot cities like Chicago and Newark and Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New Orleans. Now, it sounds like a great idea. You give parents and students alternatives to their neighborhood schools, which don't always have the best track record, which are facing these challenges. Private schools are run by, typically by nonprofits, sometimes by for-profits. They usually benefit from foundation funding from venture capitalists, which means they can have more resources. Their buildings tend to be newer. They have innovative curricula. So all of these things can create wonderful opportunities. But the problem is that they're competing for a stagnating, if not falling, pot of money with traditional neighborhood schools. So as the proportion of students in charter schools in cities like Newark grows, the funding left for public neighborhood schools decreases. Why is that a problem? Well, for several reasons. There are still students in district schools who are seeing falling funding, but another major issue has to do with equity, which is simply that charter schools typically, and this is a huge problem in Newark, do not enroll students in special education or students who are English language learners. So that's about 30% of students in Newark.
Wow.
So these students are ending up getting punted back to the very schools that are seeing their funding decrease. So the schools with the highest need are seeing their budget fall over time because of the system. So to me, that is the single largest existential threat to the principles of universal quality education. And I will say that it just presents massive financial challenges which take a real human toll. So just very quickly, and then I'll stop with this question. In Newark, here are the numbers. Today, the proportion of students that were transferred to the charter sector is 35%. By 2025, most projections estimate that that number will reach 40%. Today, in the past few years, every year, the superintendent has had to apply for emergency state aid, totaling about $19 million just to keep the schools going. If the proportion of students in charter schools reaches 40% in 2025, the school system will face a fiscal cliff. What does that mean? That means shuttering more schools. That means more students sitting in overcrowded classrooms where they do not have chairs, they do not have desks. It means cutting programs. It means keeping teachers' salary flats. It means laying off staff. All of these things have real human tolls. So it is very much an existential threat.
And am I right in understanding that the charter schools, which, as you noted, do offer choices for parents to be able to decide where they can apply for their kids to go, that they get to select the students that they receive, but that the public school system doesn't select students. They get all the students unless those students choose to leave to go somewhere else. Is that right?
That's exactly correct.
So what's the implication of that selectivity that charter schools have that the public school system doesn't have?
So it's twofold. On the one hand, it means that within the same system of public funding, you have schools that are carved out from the mandate of educating all students, which is the mandate of public education.
Right.
Charter schools do not have that mandate. They have the ability to select, and what critical scholars would call creaming and cropping, the best students. Public schools have an obligation to educate everyone, as they should. It is a universal right. It is a basic right guaranteed by the Constitution and guaranteed by the Constitution of New Jersey. And when it comes to Newark. But then the second implication, besides kind of that broader level on how we might consider the multiplying inequalities in this era, just at a very human level, if you were a parent and you were seeing the self-evidently tiered, segregated school system take form in front of you, what would you conclude about your neighborhood school? You would conclude that it's becoming a dumping grounds. That was the exact word of one of the parents I talked to, and it's stark. But then you might do everything in your power to make sure that your child, if you want to be safe, happy, well-educated, you want to increase and maximize their life chances, you are not going to send them to a school that is the dumping ground. So you see how it operates in a vicious cycle where the defunding, the privatization, mutually enable each other with negative consequences for the most vulnerable.
Wow. Yeah, as you lay that out, it's clearly a very complicated problem. And before we hear more about the different aspects of this, I'm also curious about what you perceive to be some of the most important things that the public school systems and these urban schools do well, because there are lots of challenges, you're researching the problems. But what are some of the things that they do really well that we don't usually hear about or read about in the public conversation about urban schools?
Yeah. So thank you so much for that question. It is absolutely the right question to ask. Let me start by giving a bit of background on the case of Newark, New Jersey itself.
Okay.
So in 2013, a superintendent who's imposed on the Newark by the state of New Jersey, Governor Chris Christie, is in charge at the time, drafts a plan to close or consolidate 30% of public schools in Newark. She opens dozens of new privately managed but publicly funded charter schools. She lays off hundreds of teachers, primarily Black veteran teachers, and she institutes a system of universal enrollment. It gets called the secret algorithm that matches students with either a charter school or district school. So that refunnels students in these directions, but it also undermines the tradition of neighborhood schools. It decouples schools and neighborhoods, if you will. Like, you fill out your information on this algorithm, you rank your choices for schools, and you get matched with one way or another. And it may be in your backyard, but it may not be. It may be, an hour-long bus ride across town. So these are the changes that she's putting into motion, and they happen very quickly. Those years see Newark's greatest uprising since the civil rights movement. Newark in the 60s and 70s is the epicenter of Black power. It has kind of a very proud tradition as a rebellious city, as a city that has been at the forefront of civil rights. And we see this new wave of student activism, students walking out of school, teachers picketing every Friday, principals chaining themselves to schools to stop the bulldozers, students occupying the Newark Board of Education. And so we see this uprising between, let's say, 2013, 2015 is the peak of it. The city is just not literally on fire, but metaphorically on fire, fighting back against these changes. And Eve Ewing, a wonderful sociologist who studies these same issues in Chicago, asks what I think is the right question. If these schools are failing, if these schools are so bad, then why do people fight to save them? People got fired for chaining themselves to buildings. Students were severely reprimanded for walking out of schools. Over 50% of principals, again, disproportionately of color, were pushed out by the superintendent for taking a stand against this form of restructuring. So why did they care so much? And the answer is that in most cases, people do not view these schools as failures at all. They're incredibly important institutions that stabilize neighborhoods and communities when the forces of poverty, when the forces of everyday violence, when the forces of, police brutality destabilize neighborhoods. The school stabilizes them. Teachers who have been there for 20 years, who had the siblings and maybe the parents, who know families who are willing to go to students' homes to catch them up on homework if they miss a day. Principals who set up washers in the basement for students who are homeless so that they have a place to wash their clothes. Principals who set up lights on programs where they keep the lights on until 11 p.m. every Friday and have basketball and arts and movie screenings so that kids have a safe place to be that evening. Those are the acts of people who care deeply about communities. And those are the kinds of things that were shut down. 30% of Newark public schools. So these are neighborhood stabilizing institutions that perform this incredibly important work of enacting care for people and communities. In more academic terms, we might say they stretch to fill all of the territory that's been vacated in the retreat of the welfare state. Schools do that. Teachers are the eye of the community. And that is what and so it's not just what they do well. I would argue that, they are the pillars of neighborhoods.
Now, it's interesting that you explained that role of the schools, because I remember some of the coverage that happened nationally about the function of schools across the country when the COVID pandemic began. And one of the things that became very clear to people who weren't paying attention to this before is that this is how a lot of children were eating. They were able to get their meals because they went to school, even though most people don't think of schools as the way people have food to eat. You know, we associate it with learning. But what you're saying, it just reminds me of that, because there are a lot of functions that happen not because these schools were chartered, had their mission formally to be the source of nutrition, but rather because over time they've begun to play many different roles. You're talking about supporting students who are homeless, who are suffering housing insecurity by allowing them to have clean clothes. They can do their laundry, or they get meals, or they're able to get some kind of support for their families, which becomes even, I think, even more important given the scale of the population in the urban context. Yeah, no, that's striking. And also, could you say more about the role of those teachers, because your work has examined the many different challenges that have confronted these urban schools, and there's so many different things in motion. But could you just zoom in a little bit on the importance of these different challenges and opportunities if you look at the role that teachers are playing?
And the way that you summarized it beautifully dovetails with what I want to say about teachers. And a lot of my work does focus on talking to teachers. I think we've moved a bit past this era, but if you'll recall, 2008, 2012, that was a very anti-teacher era. Governor Chris Christie was a very anti-teacher governor, and he was not the only one. It was an era when teachers were coming under all kinds of scrutiny. The movie Waiting for Superman came out. I don't know if you remember all of that, but, and so in some ways we've moved past that. But teachers have not. The morale is incredibly low. The value for their profession is very low, but more than anything, the kinds of burdens that teachers are dealing with come from two major structural shifts that have unfolded over time. And the first one we just talked about, which is what I would call an assault on public education. And the second that you were hinting at, which is a broader crisis of social reproduction. So roles that may have been taken on, support that may have been given to students and their families by other public institutions, that's disappeared through cuts in other places, cuts to welfare services, cuts to hospitals, cuts to mental health support, and a decreasing wage. And people with falling incomes or high rates of joblessness means that at home, students are just in a more precarious situation, their families are in a more precarious situation, and I don't think we fully digested as a society what that has meant for teachers who are exposed on a daily basis to students that aren't just needy because of cuts to public education, but because in all these other spheres of public life, the welfare state has retreated and offers less support for families who are struggling to get by. So teachers are taking on health and mental health functions that they're actually not formally trained to do, but that they have to do because that is what it is to be a teacher today. And on top of that, they're dealing with too large classrooms, stagnating pay, moves to evaluate them via standardized testing, things like scripting the curriculum, a lot of things that kind of erode the very thing that they love and that is their calling to do, which is teaching in a relational way. So it's an extremely difficult moment, and I think that is plainly manifested by the data. This year, Newark Public Schools started with a 19% of its teaching positions were unfilled. There is a teacher shortage across the country, and it's especially acute in poor Black and brown cities like Newark.
You said 19%? So
19%.
That's 1 out of 5. So how are the schools even able to operate? If
you put more kids in a classroom, whether or not you have a desk, whether or not you have a seat for them, you continue to swell the class sizes because you don't have a teacher. And almost every state now has emergency credentialing programs that allow teachers that have not received an advanced degree in teaching to get certified very quickly to staff these unfilled positions with people in temporary positions that rotate very quickly.
Wow. No, these are a lot of challenges. I'm just thinking about the importance of getting not only the insights from the research, but helping others to understand as they're learning about these systems. So when you're a faculty member here at Virginia Tech, and you're doing several things. You're teaching, you're doing your research, you're writing and publishing. So as you're doing those things, what are one or two of the front of mind issues or objectives that are most important for you as an outcome of that work?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and let me think about how I can answer that well. I think my research is critical. I like to examine things and question why they are the way they are, and I like to denaturalize certain phenomena.
So what does that mean?
So you might think, okay, well, Newark is a city with a very low property tax base. Schools are mainly funded with property taxes, so of course the school district is going to have challenges because it's operating under not a whole lot of money for what it needs. So that's just the reality.
The nature of reality. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, but how did that become the reality? Are there alternatives? Are there places where the school systems aren't having to work under this extreme austerity? What is so familiar and seems natural and common sense, I like to denaturalize it. And so that's how I operate. But for me, the most important thing when I end up writing up my findings is striking the right tone, because the difficulty of being a critical scholar and someone who does community-based research and ethnography with and for people on the ground is that you want to offer a critique that is helpful, and you don't want to do it from a position as an outsider who's just going to come in and say, well, the way you're doing things is not so great. Why don't you do it differently? People are trying to make their lives work amid a limited array of choices, and I am extremely empathetic to that. So striking the right tone as I write and as I report my findings, where it's like, well, here's how we got here. What if we did things differently? Here are the problems as I found them. What do you think? And having that conversation, and not making clear that I'm not here to pile on to all the negative press and media that, for example, Newark Public Schools have already gotten.
Now that makes a lot of sense. It's very clear what's at stake for the families, for the communities, for the students is driving
teachers.
The work, and the teachers. Is driving the work. So, could we just back up a little bit, and love to hear you talk about where you did your graduate training, and I'm just curious about how that shaped the way you're approaching the work and just your own sensibilities, because people can apply to different programs when they're doing graduate studies, and you can end up going to different parts of the country or even the world. There are the people who advise your work who can help to move into a particular area of research, or even just the communities that you're around, given that location. So can you tell us your story? Where'd you study? Its impact.
Sure. So I went to the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. The City University of New York has, I believe, this number is always changing, but 24 campuses across the 5 boroughs of New York City. The Graduate Center is its PhD issuing institution, although more and more it's admitting master's students as well. But it is the largest public higher education system in the country. And how much it influenced me in pursuing the research path it cannot be understated. CUNY is a wonderful institution. About 70% of our undergraduates are students of color. About 60% live in New York City in households that make less than $30,000 a year. They make tremendous sacrifices to get to college. I don't just mean taking loans. Most work at least part-time, if not full-time. And come to this university, which has a very powerful legacy, I would say, of activism, of justice-minded work, but also for a very long time, City College, for example, where I used to teach in Harvard, was known as the poor man's Harvard. Where I used to teach in Harlem was known as the poor man's Harvard. It was tuition-free. With the fiscal crises of the 70s, you see tuition get instated, and that coincides with open enrollment, which allows more and more students of color to start to populate CUNY classrooms. So you start seeing tuition, you start to see the state and the city roll back the aid and the funding that it's given for the university. And by the time you get to the 2008 crisis, CUNY is already more or less in having to make itself work when the funding is just not enough. Enrollment keeps going up, the budget is staying flat, and then it falls between 2008 and today by around 24%, less and less funding for more and more students. So how much that primed me to see what I saw in Newark, I can't.
Yeah, what's the connection? What's the relationship?
And I will say something that may or may not get me in trouble, but so, for example, our students graduate with a tremendous amount of debt. As I said, they make huge sacrifices to be able to get through college. For most of its history, the university system was free until it was majority of color, and then it became not free. To make uni free again, it would take about $800 million. That's a drop in the bucket for the entire budget of New York State or New York City, which has one of the wealthiest tax bases in the country. And I think in 2019, when Amazon was, having cities bid against each other and see what they could offer the company, New York City offered Amazon $3 billion. To Jeff Bezos, who at the time was the richest man in the world. So what did that prime me to see? Well, what we invest in or not, these are also political choices. This is not just a matter of having to make tough decisions because there's just not enough money to go around. Like, sometimes that story is true, but there are also certain decisions to make about what we invest in and what we don't.
Yeah, no, this is an important point to raise, because I was going to ask you what you might say to city officials throughout the country, because this is not just a New York or a Newark, New Jersey issue, but the cities across the country who'd say, look, we think we should, of course, support public education, and we are, but we're facing shortages in tax rolls. Our own budget is constrained, and we have growing expenses with things, and we have to make cuts across the board. We're not just reducing the funding of education, we're limited by so many different conditions, and there's only so much we are physically capable of doing. And so it sounds like you've already answered that there are still choices that happen within that context, and there are still ways that in many instances money can be found for one thing, but when it comes to the funding of public education, the answer would be no, we have less money. And why do you think that political trend of choices make? Because one of the things that you've pointed to multiple times in our conversation so far is the retraction or the withdrawal of public support, the decreasing in funding, the cuts that have been made, but the total amount of money that is being spent across the board is actually growing. And so there's more GDP, in these new services and new products. So how do you explain the politics that is guiding these choices to reduce the support for public education?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I again want to answer it in a few different ways. I think in some ways it's a symptom of a broader school of thought that is very much rooted in free market fundamentalism and free market ideals, which is that if we can open up public education to the market, in part by withdrawing public funding and increasing private options, public education will be more efficient and it'll also be more competitive, because public schools, for example, are going to have to compete with charter schools. They're competing for students, they're competing for funding, they're competing for infrastructure, they're competing for staff. So it's an incentive for everyone to race to the top, as the Obama-Arne Duncan program called its efforts to support market-based restructuring, race to the top. So that is part of why you're seeing less and less investment. It's in some way to eliminate what some economists would call the perverse incentives that don't, just giving schools more and more money to do this work when the outcomes aren't improving. It hasn't worked, so let's switch it up and let's create both accountability, disciplinary measures, and some competition to raise everyone to the top. So that's the logic. By and large, the evidence, I will say, does not support the idea that there's been improvement with withdrawal of funding or increase of competition, but that's another matter. The second thing I would say is that I do think we have to look at what the economy has looked like. And most job growth is in low-wage service jobs. So, students in Newark are likely, very likely, to face a future that may include hunger, it may include joblessness, it may include underemployment, but very diminished life chances compared to even 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I think the decision in some way reflects the belief of who's valuable, who's a bit, and who's kind of surplus in our economy.
Well, I have a couple of questions about that. Before we go further, you were talking about your decision to go to graduate school, and so you went to CUNY's graduate school. And I'm just curious also, even earlier, did you know this was the issue you wanted to study? Were there a set of experiences or things that you encountered in your earlier academic studies that helped you to decide that you wanted to focus on this for your research as a professional scholar?
So not only did I not know that I wanted to focus on this when I was encouraged by my committee and my advisors to do so, I was incredibly stubborn and obstinate about not wanting to do it, to my embarrassment today. So let me backtrack first to say that I didn't know I wanted to study geography, urban studies. I wanted to study the relationship between people and place.
Okay.
And that is because I'm very much a product of diaspora, and I was raised in several countries and several languages. And wherever I have been not quite enough to fit in. Okay. And so there's a sensibility that comes from living in that stretched space and time where you don't quite belong. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the geographer, summarizes it very beautifully, which I think is that when you live in that structurally between space where you're always neither nor, you don't quite belong, you tend to understand that elsewhere is simultaneously here. And that's just a short step from understanding I am another.
Okay.
And that was really important to me in the study of urban studies or geography, was I wanted to understand how people make a place in the world, even when their identities don't point towards fixed ways of doing so. Because that's how I grew up. I have to find a way to make a place in the world, even though my identity doesn't map onto things that are known or legible to people. And so I wanted to study that, which led me to questions of municipal finance and austerity. And I wanted to do this big, really ambitious project that looked at cuts to public services and transit and in schools
all
and in healthcare. Right. I was fine with focusing on a city, but I wanted to do the entire the story of municipal retrenchment and the retreat of the welfare state. And at some point my advisors were like, no, you should just focus on schools. And I really thought that would be too narrow, to my embarrassment. And I think
because there's not much to be said about schools.
No, not a whole lot. And also I thought it was too applied.
Okay.
And the academy kind of rewards the theoretical and the abstract sometimes. So I was like, well, I'm not an education scholar. I'm a geographer. Please don't make me do this. And I'm so embarrassed today because schools are such vital stabilizing institutions, and they are at the heart of a lot of the restructuring that we're seeing in cities today. You cannot talk about displacement in urban cores without thinking about school closures and privatization.
That's a really revealing story, because it helps me to actually understand further how you have come to this as someone who was very much consumed with a passion for understanding place geographically, because there's a way in which we tend to flatten out urban as not a place but sort of a category. But of course all of these are very specific places, and things are constituted as urban or rural or suburban because of place, and at a high level and at a granular level. So that's actually very helpful. You've given us examples, Claire, of the many different kinds of complicated systems and structures and pressures, and the human beings who are actually making decisions or who are impacted by these changes. And you're one of many experts who've been studying this. I'm wondering if you could help us to understand examples of either areas where experts have really debated what the right understanding or right path forward is, or maybe there are other areas where there's been a lot of consensus that have been opportunities for experts to say, you know what, maybe we had figured out things over here, but this seems to be pretty clear. So it's either one of those a place where you can help us to understand where the conversations are among people like you who devoted a lot of time to trying to understand these challenges?
Yeah, of course, and it's a great question. I will say that one of the single most controversial issues among scholars of what we might call a bit abstractly neoliberal education reform is what in a world do we do with charter schools? Because they're here, you know, in Newark they educate 35% of students, in New Orleans they educate 100% of students. There's no more public schools or traditionally district operated public schools in New Orleans today because the district folded with the charter school growth. So is this the path that we're headed on? People's kids are in them, as the mayor Rasbarack of Newark once said, we can't burn the buildings down, like people's kids are in there, so we do have to learn to play in the sandbox together. And in some cases, charter schools do open the life chances of students. In other ways, they perform more or less at the same level on standardized tests, if you want to use that measure, as district schools. But so what do we do with them, and how do we write about them? And there are those who want to say, look, they're here, the people who've chosen charter schools or who now see it as the only viable path because district schools have become dumping grounds. We shouldn't shame them. We shouldn't accuse them of having sold out. So, you know, can we stop talking about charter schools already and move on and try to think about how we can have more equitable outcomes for all within a tiered system. And there are those who say, like me, who take the stance that actually charterization has been an existential threat to public school systems, and that we do have to tackle the issue head on. And it is complicated because people's kids are in there, but we live in a world of complexity, and surely we can tackle these challenges head on and not pretend that charter versus district school is just a superficial grievance that we can ignore. So that's a big area of controversy and difficult to write about because I also have tremendous empathy for both charter school teachers and charter school families, you know. Then an area where there is consensus is that urban inequality today, and in geographic terms what we might call uneven development, the uneven development of the geographic urban terrain, is not sustainable. And that a lot of our theories about how cities could develop by attracting, you know, middle-income families, by even providing subsidies for people to come back from suburban areas into urban cores, what, you know, is sometimes called gentrification, that would lead to mixed-income neighborhoods and that everyone would benefit from increased diversity, more diverse social networks, increased economic opportunity, higher municipal tax bases, that all of these things would provide a net positive. I think there is growing consensus that the outcomes are much more mixed than what we thought. That mixed mixed income, multiracial neighborhoods, even when they're there nominally, there's forms of microsegregation that are tearing people apart, and you know that schools have not improved because of this, and they've just become more segregated. So we do need new theories about where to go, and I think there's consensus that we need to rethink a lot of the policy orthodoxy around urban development.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's also at some level counterintuitive because of those expectations. If you just get more people together, then it'll all move forward cohesively as opposed to people inventing new ways
to segregate
create.
themselves.
That's right, to segregate. Well, in a few minutes, we're going to invite questions from our audience. But before we do, I'd love to hear more about some of the work you're doing. So you've been talking about teaching and teachers. You're also someone who does teaching. And I'd love to hear you explain some of the examples of courses that you've taught and what you consider to be most fun and also most challenging about teaching.
Sure. So I have taught courses like an introductory urban studies course, Urban Studies 101. I've taught research methods for urban studies, and currently I'm teaching a graduate seminar on race, place, and poverty, which is actually looking at gentrification in major urban cities across the U.S. Was there a second part of it?
Yeah, just what's the most fun part of being in the classroom for you? And then are there things about it that even if you enjoy them, you find I like to say, harder than it looks on the commercial, harder than it looks on TV?
I mean, so teaching is tremendously rewarding, and I particularly love teaching in my field because it disrupts so many of the ideas that you might have about how you are a body that is bounded by the skin, and that is, we all operate from this kind of self-bounded entity. We start to think about how much of place is in us. Like, having lived in New York City for 6 years, how much of New York City is in me, and how I also make New York City through my daily actions. These are very kind of beautiful, poetic questions about the relationship between people and place that everyone can relate to, and it's particularly rewarding talking to college students about that, because they get to trace their family histories of, why did my father break down and cry when we went back to China and his childhood home no longer existed? Because we cannot make sense of who we are without place. We exist only in place. We have certain attachments to places that are part of the narrative of who we are. So of course, if your childhood home is destroyed and you didn't know that that had happened, that would have kind of a deep, immediate traumatic impact. Why do I feel different when I go home from college at Thanksgiving break after I've been living in Blacksburg? How come I feel like I don't fit in? Well, you've grown to become someone else in a new place, and as a result, your relationship to your old home is changing. And these are questions that everyone can relate to, but it really kind of shifts the focus about the way that we're all connected to each other, but also to place. And I love having students think about that. What is challenging is that every classroom is really heterogeneous. My current graduate seminar is really aimed at students who will be either researchers or practitioners in urban planning. And I have some students who, have mainly been in college. And so they don't have professional experience to draw from, and so some of the issues are newer. So how do I teach them in a fair way that will prepare them for their work, while also teaching people who've been in the field practicing for 20 years and who come with a ton of life experience, and who are more likely to be vocal and participate in discussions. So that is a challenge every day.
Well, there are lots of pieces to this work. You're a scholar who's been delving into the complexities, collecting your data, trying to understand at many levels, theoretically and at a practical level, how to really resolve a very complicated problem that needs answers. You can't just study this forever and say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. It does matter whether we solve this or not. And I'm just wondering what you yourself have found to be most significant from the learning that you've done. What insights from the work have actually been most transformative for you?
It's a good question. I think how much schools mean to people in places that are populated with moderately educated people. I think in higher income communities, there's a sense in which, I really don't mean this in an offensive way, but I think it's just true that if you come from a higher income, the instrument that you're trying to seize via education, whether K through 12 or higher education, it is more about how can I continue on the trajectory that my parents have already been on, and how can I make sure I have a stable life, a rewarding career.
Sure.
A lot of students in Newark believe that door is already closed for them, and so the roles that schools serve don't have as much to do with an upward mobility. It has much more to do with the way that schools care for them and they care for schools, the way that tradition, a school, for example, in Newark called Malcolm X Shabazz means a great deal to people in Newark. It was one of the last places that Malcolm X spoke at, before he was murdered. It's a school that your grandmother went to and your mother went to, and you're still singing the same school song, and your teacher has had numerous of your siblings and comes to your home. Like, these are all functions of community building and care.
In place.
In place.
Yeah.
And so that was really, if there's something I want people to understand about the roles that schools play, is that they can't just be measured by their achievement on like the SAT or the ACT or whatever standardized test. And that is too often how we measure the success of a school. And it ignores this whole array of work that schools do at a neighborhood, place, and individual level that is so fundamentally important to how communities get by day to day.
Yeah, wow. Well, we're going to have some questions from our audience. One of those has to do with the New Jersey itself. So there was lots of media coverage a few years ago about private investment by Mark Zuckerberg and an attempt to reform education. You referred to some of the tensions between the interest in using private capital and foundations So private wealth as a way of provisioning public education. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, I know you must be familiar with this example given your research in New Jersey, if you could talk about that example and explain what are some of the lessons to be learned.
Yeah. So when Newark Public Schools, which is the public school district in Newark, starts to be restructured in the ways that I talked about already in 2008, and it accelerates drastically after 2013. And around that time, Mark Zuckerberg gives $100 million to Newark Public Schools to develop innovative curriculum, to open new charter schools, to settle a teacher's contract. And he does this as, as charity. He sees, there's problems with Newark Public Schools. He's told by the mayor, Cory Booker, and the governor, Chris Christie at the time, we need more funds. We can make Newark the charter capital of the country. We can make Newark the model for how a poor city can achieve extraordinary educational goals, but we just need more funding.
Okay.
So he gives the district $100 million.
That's a lot of money.
It's a huge amount of money. Though Newark, I will say, already has $1 billion budget as a result of a Supreme Court decision that required suburban school districts to give some So they have funding equalization. But it's still not enough, honestly, for what the needs are and for the state of decay of the buildings.
Okay.
So he gives $100 million. Most of it, we don't have an accounting of where it went. Much of it disappeared. Some of it was used to settle a teacher contract that teachers hated. The contract was just really detrimental to their working conditions, some of which was used to open community schools, which do more of the work that I was talking about before, schools with wraparound services for students and their families that are neighborhood hubs.
Okay.
But the idea with community schools is that they would be operated by the district.
Okay.
But Mark Zuckerberg has a say in it, so he wants them to be charter community schools. So now they're a mix of charter and district schools, and it's, just say the outcomes of that educational experiment are very mixed.
Okay.
So what do we take away from that? Very wealthy philanthropists giving money to school districts is wonderful on paper. How it turns out is as tenuous as anything else. There wasn't a straight line from the injection of that funding to improvements in the district, but there was a whole lot of resentment towards the backdoor actions of Governor Chris Christie, Mayor Cory Booker, and Superintendent Cahen Anderson, who made this decision without closed doors and who have had to show no accountability for how that money was spent or not, or disappeared.
And I'm sure people are wondering, well, was that just one incredibly bad example, or is that the trend where you're seeing mixed results with this infusion of private money into public school system to try to create some solutions?
Yeah, no, it's the trend.
That's the trend.
It's the trend. And it's complicated, and the story of corruption within urban school districts has been told so many times. I hate to add on to it, but these are big bureaucracies, and now they have a whole array of players who weren't there before, such as venture capitalists who are investing in educational technology, charter school operators, for-profit networks of schools, people who are devising new standardized tests. So, $1 billion budget is what the Newark Board of Education has. That's a whole lot of money. And a lot of people are competing for contracts with that district.
Okay.
So imagine managing and giving a full accounting of that.
Yeah. Wow.
Things happen.
Wow. We have another question from the audience that's about the charter schools, and the question is that you mentioned you're not a big supporter of charter schools, but this person is wondering, are there lessons learned or insights from charter schools that might be usefully applied to public schools?
It's a good question. So I will say it's not charter schools per se that I have I have seen a problem with in my research. The problem is that they're competing. The problem is the competition, and that competition, from what I have seen and from what large-scale quantitative studies show, is that it leaves the most vulnerable students behind. So to me, that
if they had to accept all students in the way that public district schools, would that?
It might. There would be other problems because charters have a certain philosophy that I don't know if the charters operate through a system of churn. If they're not performing well, they close. As we know, closing schools is traumatic.
Yes.
They want their teachers to churn.
Right.
Charter school teachers work for a year or two. They're uncertified, straight out of college, and then they leave.
Okay.
Personally, I would rather have teachers with longevity, but we can talk about all of that. But the biggest problem is the competition for me. But what have they done well? Charter schools require really long hours from their educators and lots of additional out-of-school activities. I don't think that's sustainable, but I do think that some of what they have educators do, like do home visits to students and their families as a regular practice, also make sure that like every educator is involved in at least one extracurricular activity. That is a really wonderful way of rounding out the work and deepening the ties, but I think it has to come with some kind of reduction of workload in the classroom.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's important. Well, we're going to end with you. Maybe I'd love to hear saying what you find most inspiring about this work, because it's lots of challenges, tremendous complexities that are really hard to figure out. But what's at the end of the day, as you're doing this, what is it that is most important to inspire you to continue doing the work?
I get my energy from doing ethnographic. So my work is ethnographic. It's qualitative. I use quantitative research to supplement, but the bulk of my work comes from embedding myself in places, being a scholar activist, seeing where I can be helpful to people, and there are no shortage of things that get brought up in that work and in those conversations that keep me going, because we are living in critical condition, in my opinion. And the day-to-day tasks that are required just for survival are not that easy. And people face incredibly difficult choices as they try to make their lives work. So, every time that writing can feel like staring down a well sometimes, as we all know, and you don't know how your work is going to be received. You don't know how many people are going to read it.
Yeah.
But then I go back and say, look, this is what I found, or have an interview where somebody just shares these beautiful stories of how they've lived in Newark their entire life, and their 2 children are in public schools, and they teach this subject, and it reinvigorates them day after day, and and I realize kind of all the ordinary heroism, like how heroic it is, to be a teacher, to be a parent, to be a student, taking care of siblings, and that keeps me going.
Wow. Well, I want to thank you. Professor Claire Cahen has been our guest today, for taking time to talk with us about the important work that you're doing, looking at urban schools. I want to thank our viewers as well. We have the Vox Humanities conversations that you've been watching with us. We also have a podcast that's Vox Humanities. You can hear that podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Sylvester Johnson, and on behalf of myself and the entire crew for Vox Humanities Conversations and the staff at the Center for Humanities, I'd like to thank you for watching.